automatically mute when you're in a call?
No. I can hear you. You can hear me.
Well, I mean mute other sounds, like chatting sounds. Here, let me test something out.
Audio tests on another show of Linux.
So let me mute that sound just in case someone messages me.
Okay. Well, a couple of things to take care of before we get into this week's show. First off, I gotta thank Jordan for his shout out, which I'd actually forgotten about before we started the show, and then James reminded me, like, oh yeah, it's on my to-do list to thank him for that. Cause
definitely not a big deal, and I appreciate the opportunity to be doing the show with you guys.
I'm glad we could get that going. Because that's one of the things we got. Another thing to take care of before we get on going. A couple of weeks ago, I said there's a way to log into more than one Google account through other browsers than Chrome, where you can be in a separate Google account per Google service. I didn't explain how to do it, and since then, more than one person has asked how to do it. Somebody actually asked on the video, and I was doing 8 billion different things when they asked, and I closed the window, and I couldn't remember what video I said it in, so I couldn't even remember, okay, I know there's a comment here I need to reply to of the few hundred, and now somebody else asked again, and it's come back on. So both Commodore 256 and other people are asking, here's the trick to that. What you do is you open your browser, and you open each Google service you're going to want to go into. You open like Gmail, Google Docs, YouTube, whatever services you're going to go into. And you be logged out of all Google accounts. And on each and every one of those windows, you click the login button. So every single one of them has a login prompt screen. And you go and log into, you log into whichever account you want to tie that browser to per service. And as long as you don't log out of any services, it will keep them separate. And the cookies will keep track, and it'll keep you going. Problem is, if you log out of all of them. So it's not a perfect trick, but it works for if you're doing this on your personal computer and a computer you're taking with you. I don't recommend doing this in a public place, because you have to remember to click the logout button. Now, good news is the logout button logs out of all of the accounts of all Google services, because it sends the global logout. I do think that if you really do want to do that, and you don't wear a tinfoil hat, and you don't have any concerns with the fact that Chrome is doing the linking without linking, then Chrome is probably the better browser to use for that. Since Firefox is still my primary browser, that's still the way I do it. I have also noticed that the one that seems to be the overriding one is Gmail. It's like if you're going to log into Gmail and all the other services are going to be other accounts, log into Gmail first. The order you do that is do the Gmail first, then do all the other ones, because any new services you start will be linked to the last one, and Gmail seems to want to override them. It's weird, but the other ones don't override Gmail. Anyways, hopefully that makes sense to people. Anything else we need to get into before we get into our myth?
Normally, if I'm going to do something like that with Firefox, I use the Gmail Manager, which lets me know when I've got new messages. It ends up being a bunch of extra clicks to go into the separate Gmail accounts, but you have one open at a time, and it'll let you know when you've got new mail on the others.
And honestly, if I'm going to be managing a bunch of Gmail accounts, I prefer to just use something like Thunderbird and IMAP. Just
that
because,
would probably make more sense.
Yeah, it works a lot smoother, and I have a local copy on the system. Well, you don't have a local copy, but you can if you want. Anyways. Okay, we got a really light show this week, but it's a complex topic, so we're probably going to fill some time with it. And that is a not completely unfounded, but albeit largely myth, that Linux users will not buy software. Who wants to start on this? Like, before we were starting here, James, you were saying you were pointing out it isn't entirely unfounded, or.
Well, in the studies, there was a study with Android, and I'm fairly sure that this would be shown in other studies, because it seems true that what I have heard is that they tend to get a lot more free software than paid software. Like on Android, most of the software that people are buying is free, or not buying. People are installing.
Most of the apps that people are loading are free. And the iPhone, it's the other way around. And it's the same thing in Linux. Most stuff on Linux, open source doesn't mean free. There's free as in no bling bling, and there's free as in free and open licensing and open source and yada yada and so forth. It doesn't have to be one to be the other. And the real catch-22 is, like you're saying, the average open source / Linux user, at least today, is not an idiot. If there's a free application that does more than a penny ante paid application, nobody is going to buy the penny ante paid application. One of the perfect examples of this is not too long ago, I think it was back in 2006, Nero released a version of the paid version of Nero for Linux. And it was just, it was one of those pieces of software, I think unilaterally the open source community was, this is going to hurt us. Because nobody's going to buy it, and everybody's going to cite this as an example that we don't want to buy software. It wasn't the fact that Nero didn't do what it does okay, it's the fact that every CD burning tool in Linux that's free does more.
Or does it just as well?
Or yeah, did it as well or better than this version of Nero that was released for Linux. It's the same thing with Winamp. You know, the Winamp for Linux thing has kind of died because nobody was converting to a paid version of Winamp. Then again, I'd be willing to bet most Windows users don't convert to a paid version of Winamp either. But there's other things like that. However, if you're talking about software that really fills a niche, I think Adobe would probably sell really well on Linux. Even though we have GIMP, if you're doing...
There are some specialty things you can do with other Adobe software that the open source doesn't 100% fulfill.
Right. It's like, and that's
I think there's another thing. A lot of people have this mentality that you get what you pay for, right? And of course,
yeah, that hurts Linux somewhat.
Don't have this mentality because we know that we can get something free.
That's
and it can
pretty damn good.
Yeah, but a lot of people have this mentality, and I'm pretty sure that Apple users have this mentality that, you know, if something costs more, it's a better quality thing. So even if there is a free version, they might buy the version because it costs more simply because they think that it'll be better. Because they have that mentality that you get what you pay for.
I don't know if that's true, but that's definitely true of some Apple users because I can't count the number of $5 plugins that only exist because of mountains being made out of molehills that exist for OS X and Safari and other things like that are free in Firefox and pretty much any other browser, and they're free in Linux, and they're even free in Windows. Because it's like, I guess, like you're saying, if you didn't pay for it, it can't be any good mentality is being fought there a little bit. But like you're saying, if you're on Linux, an OS that for the most part is largely free. We should point out there are versions of Linux that you do actually have to pay for. They're not very popular and don't have a really strong user base, but there are versions of Linux you have to pay for. And they fall into two groups. There's things like, I'm going to mispronounce this, but Xandra OS, whatever, the people... Xandros, yeah. Yeah, Xandros, they're a paid Linux distro. And then there's paid Linux distros like Red Hat, where the distro isn't actually what you're paying for. You're paying for the support that goes with that enterprise thing. And there is a very comparable free version that is quote-unquote unsupported in Fedora.
Well, actually, CentOS is built from the same SRPMs as Red Hat Enterprise Linux.
Okay.
So that actually goes to sort of support that we don't want to pay for it, but at the same time, enough people do pay for Red Hat Enterprise that it's still in business.
No, Red Hat is a very profitable company.
Yeah.
And it keeps growing.
And they do more things than just sell support for Red Hat Enterprise Linux.
No, that's the thing. And at the end of the day, that company does get the open source community. That's the thing. If you want to sell to Linux, you don't rape the open source community. You become a part of the open source community. You support the open source community. Even if you don't make all of your stuff open source and give it over, you can still have trade secrets. We're not going to hold it against you. We're going to frown a little bit, but we're not going to lynch you with it because there's some circumstances where that's called for. A perfect example of that's one example of successful paid-for Linux software. Another good example of successful paid-for Linux software is Crossover. That's also it's also for the Mac, but it's very successful on Linux. If you're doing one of those things where wine doesn't just quite get you there and you need, and they have, I think the reason they're so successful is they continue to work even to this day with the wine project to make wine better.
The biggest contributors to the wine project is code weavers, and those are the people that make Crossover.
Those are the people who make Crossover, yeah.
And it's the same thing with Red Hat. Red Hat donates a huge amount of its profits back to Linux.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and a huge amount of code as well.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. They're like, you're giving us money to do this work, which we're then going to contribute to the community to make the community stronger, so you will then give us more money. It's a nice cycle. It works rather well. But that's a mentality that most software vendors don't get. The software logic is, I have to come in here and I have to rape you, and I have to set licensing where I artificially limit what my software can do, and then make you give me more money to unlock features that were already there, and that business model doesn't really work well in Linux. I would argue that's an old business model even in Windows, but there's a lot of people still trying it. I don't know about that. But I'm trying to think of another, I mean, we've named two. I'm trying to think of another good one that people would actually know. There's loads of pro Linux software, but that stuff starts at $5,000 and quickly becomes 30, 40, 50 grand software.
There's also the Mandriva Power Pack.
I'm not familiar with that, actually.
It's a paid version of Mandriva that, if I remember correctly, comes with codecs and some more consumer-friendly software out of the box rather than having to go get it after you've installed it. And from what I understand, they're doing okay with it, aside from Mandriva having some financial problems that they were having.
Okay. That almost seems like splitting a hair, but if people are willing to pay for it, that's... Just because there are other distros that fill that need rather well that don't charge for it. But it's... Yeah, then again, it's... All distros have... This is one of those things that I'm not quite sure how it works, and I don't ever want to pick on it because I'm afraid of ever. This is not something that should be picked on. Every Linux distro has almost a fanboy cult-like following, but yet they're perfectly okay that other distros also have a cult-like fanboy mentality, and they don't. It's almost like if all the religions on the planet didn't try and convert you to their religion, they just said, I think this is the best religion because, and then moved on. I haven't quite been able to figure out. Yeah, it's not always true, but it's largely true with Linux.
I don't know about that. There's a few key distros that really do try to convert to people.
Like, name one off the top of your head.
Well, every time you hear about Ubuntu, anywhere, YouTube, the news, I'm talking about Google News, Internet News, just random posts. Some guy is always there to talk to you about, have you tried Linux Mint? You should try Linux Mint. You'll like it. It's not aggressive, but there's a huge amount of people just everywhere you look. Every time you hear the word Ubuntu, there's going to be someone talking to you about you should be trying Linux Mint, at least as well.